Police dog refused to let the pilot board the plane. What they found underneath sent them running. It was a typical morning at the bustling regional airport. The sun had only just begun to rise, casting a soft glow over the tarmac as passengers started to trickle in for their early flights. Most people were busy preparing for their trips, checking in their luggage, grabbing a coffee, and reading through their boarding passes. It was a scene repeated in airports all over the world every day. But little did anyone know, this morning was going to be different. Among the crowd of travelers was one particular passenger that caught the attention of security staff. He was a seasoned airline pilot, dressed neatly in his crisp uniform. His professional demeanor made him look like just another airline employee on his way to the cockpit, ready to take control of his next flight. The pilot had flown many times before, and this was just another routine journey. But that routine was about to be disrupted. As the pilot approached the security checkpoint, everything seemed normal at first. He placed his carry-on bag on the conveyor belt, removed his shoes, and proceeded through the metal detectors as usual. The airport security team, although busy with the usual morning rush, kept an eye on him just as they did with every other passenger. But then something caught their attention. Standing near the checkpoint was a highly trained police dog assigned to the airport to help detect illegal substances. The dog, a German shepherd named Max, was well known to the security team. Max had been working at the airport for over 2 years, and his impeccable record of sniffing out everything from narcotics to explosives made him an invaluable asset to the team. He had a reputation for being able to sense even the smallest traces of drugs or other illicit substances. As the pilot approached, Max began to act strangely. At first, it was subtle, just a shift in his stance, a sudden focus on the pilot's movements. But then Max's behavior escalated. He began to growl low in his throat, his body tensing as he fixed his gaze on the pilot. The growling soon turned into frantic barking as he pulled on his leash, trying to move toward the pilot. The handler, Officer Daniels, who had been watching closely, immediately noticed the shift in Max's behavior. It wasn't like Max to become so agitated without reason. Officer Daniels, familiar with his dog's instincts, knew something wasn't right. His first thought was that Max had detected something in the pilot's bag or on his clothing. But why would the dog react so intensely to a seemingly normal passenger? The airport security team quickly moved to stop the pilot, asking him to step aside. At first, the pilot, looking confused and a bit surprised, complied. He hadn't done anything wrong, so he wasn't sure why he was being singled out. Still, he was a professional and understood the importance of security at airports. Officer Daniels approached the pilot and tried to reassure him. "Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. It's just a precaution. We need to check your bag again." The pilot nodded, still not fully understanding the situation. He was used to the standard security checks, but this was different. The dog's behavior was unusual, even for a drug detection dog. As Max continued to bark and pull towards him, the security team took immediate action. They directed the pilot to a separate area for further screening. The pilot stood there, waiting as security officers began inspecting his carry-on bag. He could feel the tension in the air, and a slight sense of unease crept up on him. But he was a professional. He had nothing to hide. As the officers unzipped his suitcase and began to sift through its contents, the pilot did his best to remain calm. Max, however, wasn't calming down. The dog was still fixated on the pilot's luggage, showing no signs of backing off. Officer Daniels knew this wasn't a false alarm. Max was trying to communicate something, and he had never been wrong in the past. There was something in that bag, and it was making Max react in a way he had never done before. "Let's do a more thorough search," Officer Daniels said, signaling to the other officers. The pilot, though still confused, didn't object. He stood there, watching as they carefully checked every inch of his belongings. They even swabbed the exterior of his bag, testing for traces of drugs or explosives. Nothing came up on the first round of checks, which only added to the confusion. The officers and the pilot were both baffled. It seemed like an overreaction. There was nothing in his bag to suggest any wrongdoing. But Max wasn't giving up. He was still tugging at his leash, barking frantically, his focus unwavering. At this point, the airport authorities decided to call in backup. They weren't taking any chances. Another officer, Sergeant Simmons, arrived with additional equipment, and the decision was made to inspect the bag more thoroughly. They knew they had to be meticulous. If Max, the trained drug-sniffing dog, was this insistent, there had to be a reason. As they started the second round of searching, the pilot's anxiety grew. He tried to stay calm, but the growing crowd of security staff and the police dog's frantic barking were starting to get to him. He was still trying to figure out why all this was happening. Had he accidentally brought something forbidden? He couldn't think of anything that could have set the dog off, but the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. And then, just as they were about to give up, something unexpected happened. As an officer lifted the false bottom of his suitcase, a hidden compartment was revealed. It was a carefully concealed section of the bag, one that no one had noticed before. The officer gently pried it open, and what they found inside made everyone stop in their tracks. It wasn't what anyone had expected. The suitcase wasn't just full of clothes. Underneath the neatly folded shirts and pants, there was something much more sinister hidden away. Wrapped in layers of foil and plastic, several bundles were packed tightly together. At first, no one could tell what they were. But the moment the officer's hand brushed against the bundles, Max's barking grew even louder. The dog was now frantic, as if trying to warn everyone about the contents inside. The officers exchanged nervous glances. Max's behavior had not been a coincidence. They had stumbled upon something they hadn't expected, and it was about to change everything. The discovery inside the pilot's suitcase sent a wave of shock through the security team. Officer Daniels and his colleagues stood frozen for a moment, staring at the contents of the hidden compartment. The neatly wrapped bundles inside were not ordinary travel items. The foil and plastic packaging were unusual, and the tight packing made it clear that whatever was hidden there was important, or at least valuable to someone. Max, the police dog, was still barking incessantly, his attention fixed entirely on the contents of the suitcase. His growls were a clear sign that something about this find was extremely concerning. Officer Daniels quickly signaled for a second look, his suspicion growing with each passing second. The suitcase was carefully set down on a nearby table, and one of the officers began cutting through the layers of wrapping. The room was tense, filled with the soft sounds of the officers working together to examine what had been concealed. Each officer moved carefully, their hands steady as they pried apart the layers, revealing more of what had been hidden. What they found inside was unlike anything they had expected. The wrapped bundles were carefully stacked, each one looking precisely the same. At first, they appeared to be tightly wrapped packages of an unknown substance, and the officers quickly realized they were dealing with something more than just a casual smuggling attempt. Officer Daniels took a step back, his mind racing as he thought about the implications of what they had found. The pilot had been so casual in his approach to the checkpoint, seemingly unaware that his bag would be searched so thoroughly. But this discovery meant something much bigger was at play. They weren't dealing with a simple mistake. This was deliberate, and it was clear that the pilot was involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The officers continued to carefully examine the contents, and it didn't take long before the truth became undeniable. The bundles were filled with a substance that looked suspiciously like a high-grade material, one that was often used in illegal activities. While it was still not entirely clear what the substance was, the way it was wrapped and concealed spoke volumes. It was a professional job, and it had been done with great care and expertise. The dog's behavior was a key factor in this discovery. Max had reacted with such intensity that there was no mistaking it. There was something in that suitcase that needed to be found. The more the officers thought about it, the clearer it became. Max's training had led them to something they couldn't ignore. Despite the tension, Officer Daniels took a deep breath and reached for his radio. He needed to report the situation to higher authorities. "We've found something," he said into the device, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "I need backup. It's not just drugs. There's more to this than we thought." While he spoke, another officer had started testing the substance, using a portable scanner to detect its chemical composition. The results were quick to come in, and they confirmed their worst suspicions. The substance was indeed illegal, something that was not only prohibited in their jurisdiction, but something that could cause serious harm if not dealt with properly. As the officers worked, they began to piece together the puzzle. The pilot had seemed completely normal at first, just another person traveling for work. But now it was clear that he had been hiding something, and the question remained, why was he involved in such a scheme? The pilot, still standing off to the side, was watching the officers with growing unease. His calm demeanor had started to crack, his face growing pale as the situation unfolded. He had thought he could sneak by without anyone noticing, but now it was all coming to light. The officers had already discovered what he had been hiding, and they were beginning to put together the pieces of a larger story. Officer Daniels walked over to the pilot, his face serious. "We need you to stay here for a while," he said. The pilot didn't argue. He stood there, silent, his eyes darting nervously between the officers and the suitcase on the table. It was clear he was trying to think of an explanation, but nothing he could say would change what was happening now. As the backup team arrived, the airport security began to cordon off the area, ensuring no one else would interfere with the investigation. The entire scene was turning into a full-blown operation. This was no longer a simple security check. It had become something much bigger. The presence of the illegal substance indicated that there was likely a network behind it, one that the authorities needed to track down before it spread further. While the officers continued their work, the pilot was escorted to a more secure area where he would be questioned. They needed to know everything, the who, the why, and the how. But there was one thing that was already clear. The pilot was not just an innocent passenger. His involvement in whatever operation was unfolding was far too deep to ignore. Max, the police dog, was still on high alert. The scent was unmistakable, and he had done his job flawlessly. He had led the officers directly to the hidden compartment, and now it was time for them to figure out what had been going on behind the scenes. As the team continued to process the scene, they started to consider the bigger picture. The pilot was well-versed in his duties and had flown countless flights without incident. Yet, he had been involved in something far darker than they had anticipated. There were questions about how long this had been going on and whether he had been involved in other operations like this one before. The more the officers dug into the situation, the more they realized that the pilot had been just one cog in a much larger machine. But for now, they had to focus on the immediate discovery. The substance was now in their possession, and the pilot's fate hung in the balance as they worked to uncover the truth. The investigation had only just begun. The officers knew they had a lot of work ahead of them. They needed to figure out who else was involved, where the smuggled items were headed, and how this had all been orchestrated. The dog's instincts had saved them from a disaster, and now they had to ensure that the network behind it was brought to justice. The air in the room was thick with anticipation as the investigation continued. The pilot sat in a small, isolated room at the airport, waiting for the officers to return with answers. His heart raced, and his mind was a blur of thoughts. He couldn't believe what was happening. Just hours ago, he had been preparing for another routine flight, a simple day at work. But now, everything had changed. He was no longer just a passenger. He was a suspect in an investigation that was growing more serious by the minute. Outside the room, the officers were busy. Officer Daniels had already contacted his superiors and explained the situation. He knew this wasn't just a random mistake. The pilot's suitcase, with its hidden compartment and suspicious bundles, was proof of that. They weren't dealing with a simple smuggling operation. Something much larger was at play. The officer walked over to the table where the wrapped bundles were carefully laid out. They had already tested the substance, confirming it was something dangerous, illegal, and highly sought after. The authorities had seen this type of material before in larger smuggling rings, but this was different. This wasn't just some random criminal trying to make a quick profit. The operation was organized, carefully planned, and operated by people who knew exactly what they were doing. As the officers continued their work, Officer Daniels couldn't help but wonder how deep the pilot was involved in this scheme. How long had he been smuggling items like this under the radar? It seemed impossible to believe that someone with such a trusted role in the airline industry could be involved in criminal activity. But the evidence was clear. The pilot had been hiding something, and now it was time to find out why. The investigation team expanded as more officers arrived on the scene. They began taking detailed notes, analyzing every piece of evidence, and searching for any connections between the pilot and the operation that had led to this discovery. They also made sure to carefully document every aspect of the suitcase and its contents. This would be important in building the case. Meanwhile, the pilot was being questioned in the secure room. He sat alone, his hands fidgeting nervously. He had been through interviews before, but this felt different. He wasn't just answering questions. He was trying to explain himself in a situation that made no sense. He could hardly believe it himself. His once simple career as an airline pilot had now become the center of an investigation that threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. The door to the room opened, and Officer Daniels stepped inside, followed by another officer. The pilot looked up, his eyes filled with anxiety. He knew the questions were coming, but he wasn't sure how to answer. He had never been in a situation like this before. "We need to know everything, Mr. Reynolds," Officer Daniels said, his voice calm but firm. "How long have you been involved in this?" The pilot, whose name was Stephen Reynolds, took a deep breath and stared at the floor. His mind raced, trying to piece together a response. He had never intended for any of this to happen. It all started so innocently, just a way to make extra money on the side. But now, as the reality of the situation sank in, he realized just how wrong things had gone. "I didn't mean for this to get out of hand," Stephen finally said, his voice shaking. "It was supposed to be just one job, a way to make some extra cash. I wasn't thinking straight." Officer Daniels leaned forward. "Tell me everything, Mr. Reynolds. What exactly were you doing? Who were you working with?" Stephen hesitated. His fingers clenched into fists as he tried to collect his thoughts. He knew he had to be careful. If he gave the wrong answers, he could make things worse for himself. But at the same time, he knew there was no turning back now. The discovery had already been made, and his involvement was undeniable. I wasn't working alone," Stephen began, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's a group. They asked me to transport things from one place to another. At first, I didn't ask questions. I thought it was harmless, just a quick exchange. I didn't know the full extent of it, I swear." Officer Daniels listened intently, nodding slowly. "So you've been smuggling items on your flights. How long has this been going on?" Stephen swallowed hard, his throat dry. "A few months, but I never thought it would get this far. They used my position to their advantage. I was just a pilot. They told me it was simple. I'd pick up something, drop it off somewhere else. That's it. But now, looking back, I see how stupid I was." The officers exchanged glances. The story was starting to make sense, but there were still so many unanswered questions. Who were the people behind this operation? How large was the network? And why had Stephen agreed to take such risks? Officer Daniels pressed on. "Who else is involved, Mr. Reynolds? We need names. We need to understand how big this is." Stephen hesitated again, his mind racing. He knew he was in deep trouble, but he didn't want to betray the others involved. They had made him promises, assured him that everything would be fine. But now, everything was falling apart. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, and he felt the full extent of the consequences. "I don't know all of their names," Stephen finally admitted. "I never met anyone face to face. It was all done through messages, phone calls. They made sure I stayed in the dark. I only knew what I had to know. I wasn't supposed to ask too many questions." The officers leaned in closer, their eyes narrowing. This was a major lead. The network was more sophisticated than they had initially thought. It wasn't just a case of one person making bad choices. It was an organized system, and now they had a pilot who had been roped into it. The pieces were beginning to come together. "We're going to need your full cooperation, Mr. Reynolds," Officer Daniels said. "If you help us, we can work with you, but if you hold back, it will only make things worse." Stephen nodded, his face pale and drawn. He knew the gravity of the situation. He was already in too deep, and there was no way out. The authorities needed to know everything, and he had no choice but to tell them what he knew. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. Who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? And how much danger was he really in? As the questioning continued, the officers knew they were dealing with something much bigger than a single smuggler. They were dealing with a network, one that could stretch across states, possibly even countries. And the more they learned, the more they realized that this investigation was just beginning. As the investigation progressed, the officers started to uncover more pieces of the puzzle. The pilot, Stephen Reynolds, had shared everything he knew, but the officers knew they were still only scratching the surface. They had learned about the small-scale operation he had been involved in, but there was a bigger picture. The more they learned, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about one pilot smuggling goods. This was part of a much larger network, and the truth was still hidden beneath layers of secrecy. Officer Daniels couldn't shake the thought of how Stephen had been pulled into this world. The pilot wasn't a hardened criminal. He was a professional who had always done his job without question. Yet somehow he had gotten tangled in something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Now, the officers had to figure out who else was involved, and more importantly, how deep the network went. Stephen had described the operation in enough detail for the officers to realize they were dealing with an organized syndicate. But what they didn't know was how extensive it really was. They needed more leads, more names, more information about how the syndicate worked. Stephen, despite his regret and fear, didn't have much more to offer. He had been kept in the dark, just one cog in the machine. But the authorities weren't about to give up just yet. The team worked tirelessly through the night. Officers combed through the pilot's phone records, emails, and flight schedules. They found that Stephen had made several strange phone calls, all of which seemed innocent at first glance. But after further inspection, it became clear that these calls were part of the operation. The calls weren't just about flights. They were about coordinating the smuggling of goods. It was a methodical process, one that had been happening right under the noses of airport security for months. It didn't take long for the officers to connect the dots. The calls were often made to someone with an untraceable number, but after tracking some of the phone numbers, the team realized they were connected to other pilots, flight attendants, and even ground crew at various airports. This was a well-established network, one that used the airline industry's trust and structure to move illicit goods from one location to another. The officers knew they had to act quickly. They couldn't afford to let the operation continue any longer. They were close, but the network was large, and the people behind it were careful. If they didn't move fast, the criminals would slip through their fingers, and they would be left with nothing but a few broken leads. They had to find the mastermind behind it all, the one pulling the strings from behind the scenes. Stephen had been in the dark about the big picture, but he was the key to unraveling it. He had seen enough to understand that he was just a small part of the larger operation. He hadn't realized the full scope of what was happening, but now that he was caught, he wanted to make things right. His cooperation was invaluable, and the officers knew they had to use his knowledge to track down the leaders of the syndicate. The investigation took a new turn when the team discovered a crucial piece of information hidden in Stephen's flight logs. One of the flights he had taken in the past few months had been a bit out of the ordinary. It wasn't a scheduled flight. It had been a last-minute addition. The paperwork had been processed quickly, and the flight was arranged with little oversight. It was exactly the kind of flight that would go unnoticed if someone was trying to smuggle something across borders. Officer Daniels stared at the flight details, a sense of urgency rising in his chest. This flight, he realized, had been the perfect cover for transporting something much more valuable than just luggage. It wasn't just a regular flight. It was a key moment in the operation, and it had happened right under their noses. With this new lead, the officers began to dig deeper into the flight records, cross-referencing them with other suspicious activities. What they found was both shocking and disturbing. The flight had carried more than just passengers. It had carried illicit goods, hidden under layers of innocuous-looking luggage. The operation had been planned meticulously, and now the officers were seeing how well coordinated it was. This wasn't just a few rogue individuals. It was an international syndicate with connections in multiple countries. The officers began to realize how deep the network went. They weren't just looking for one or two criminals. They were hunting down a large-scale operation with multiple moving parts. The flight attendants, ground crew, and even some of the airport staff had been complicit in the scheme, knowingly or unknowingly facilitating the smuggling process. But the most disturbing part of all was that the syndicate had been using legitimate cargo flights, passenger flights, and even private jets to move illicit goods across the globe. The sheer scale of it was mind-boggling, and the officers knew that if they didn't move fast, the criminals would be able to cover their tracks and disappear before they could be caught. Stephen, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, sat in the small room where he had been questioned. He was shaken, but determined to make things right. The officers had promised him that his cooperation would help him, but Stephen knew that there was no turning back now. His life had been turned upside down, and he had no choice but to face the consequences of his actions. But even so, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. At least he was no longer part of the syndicate's operation. At least now, the authorities were finally starting to put the pieces together. But even as the officers worked around the clock to track down the rest of the syndicate, they knew that the most dangerous part of the operation was yet to come. The mastermind behind the syndicate was still out there, pulling the strings from the shadows. And if they didn't find him soon, the entire operation could continue without any further interruptions. As the investigation continued, the officers received a tip-off from a source within the airline industry. It was a risky move, but the officers knew they had to act on it. The tip led them to a meeting between two key figures within the syndicate, both of whom had been operating in the background, hidden from the authorities. The officers prepared to move in quickly, knowing that this could be their best chance to catch the criminals red-handed. The investigation was now at a critical juncture. The officers were getting closer to the truth, but the clock was ticking. They had to move fast, or they risked losing the opportunity to bring the syndicate to justice. The mastermind was out there, and every minute they spent chasing leads brought them closer to the moment when the criminals would either be caught or slip away forever. The investigation had reached a critical point. Officer Daniels and his team were now working with an urgency they had never felt before. The discovery of Stephen Reynolds' involvement in the smuggling operation had opened a floodgate of new leads, and the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that they were up against something far bigger than they had initially thought. This wasn't just a small-time smuggling ring. It was a sophisticated, well-organized criminal network with global reach, and they had to bring it down before it could slip away. Stephen, sitting in the small interrogation room, was still coming to terms with the extent of his involvement. The officers had been kind to him, offering him a chance to make things right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in way over his head. He had never imagined that his small part in the operation would lead to something so massive. He had thought he was just transporting a few innocuous items, but now he understood the severity of his actions. He felt trapped by his choices, trapped by the people who had manipulated him, and now he had to face the consequences. The team's attention was on the next steps, finding the key players in the operation, the ones pulling the strings from behind the scenes. They were determined to bring them down, but the process was painstaking. Each lead had to be carefully followed. Every phone call, every flight log, and every connection between those involved had to be tracked and cross-checked. The officers were under immense pressure, but they knew that the stakes had never been higher. The operation was now growing larger with each new revelation. The officers had uncovered that the syndicate wasn't just limited to one airport or one city. It stretched across several regions, with people involved in multiple countries. There were whispers of high-ranking officials, people who held positions of power in the airline industry, whose names were slowly starting to surface in the investigation. These were the people who had coordinated the flights, planned the routes, and ensured that everything ran smoothly without drawing attention. As the investigation continued, it became clear that this was no ordinary crime syndicate. It was an international network, with connections in every major city. The group had been operating under the radar for years, and now they were exposed. The authorities had a solid lead, but the criminals they were chasing were also highly skilled in covering their tracks. The officers knew they had to move fast before the syndicate could adapt and go even deeper underground. Officer Daniels sat at his desk, looking over the latest batch of information. His mind raced as he processed the details. It wasn't just the flight logs and phone records that had caught his attention. It was the patterns. The way the flights were scheduled, the way certain locations were repeatedly used, the way different people were connected to the same set of destinations. It was all coming together. There was a bigger plan, something more coordinated than a series of random smuggling attempts. The more he looked at it, the more he realized that the syndicate had been carefully laying the groundwork for a much larger operation. The officers decided to act on their most recent lead, a meeting between two key members of the syndicate. The tip had come from an anonymous source, but it was one the team couldn't ignore. The meeting was set to take place in a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The officers knew that this could be their chance to catch the criminals red-handed. The mastermind might finally be within reach. The night before the planned operation, the team gathered in the conference room to prepare. Maps were spread out on the table, and each officer was assigned a role. The plan was simple: get in, gather evidence, and arrest those involved. The officers knew that the criminals were likely armed and would do whatever it took to protect their operation. The risk was high, but so was the potential reward. If they were successful, they would have enough evidence to bring down the entire syndicate. As the hours passed, the officers worked tirelessly, making sure every detail was covered. The timing had to be perfect. If they acted too soon, they could miss the criminals. If they waited too long, the criminals might slip away. The tension was palpable, but everyone knew what was at stake. This was their chance to shut down an operation that had been allowed to operate unchecked for too long. The next morning, as the team prepared to move out, Stephen Reynolds was once again brought in for questioning. He had been cooperative, but now the officers needed more from him. They needed to know everything, every name, every detail that he might have overlooked. The pressure was mounting, but Stephen remained calm. He understood the gravity of the situation now, and he knew that this was his last chance to make amends. "I'm sorry," Stephen said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should have never gotten involved. I didn't know it would get this far." "We know you didn't, Mr. Reynolds," Officer Daniels replied. "But we need you to tell us everything you know. The people we're after, they're dangerous. If you help us, we can make sure you get the help you need. But we need to move fast." Stephen nodded. He knew that there was no going back. The officers had already promised him protection, but the reality of what was happening was hitting him harder than ever. He had been a part of something far bigger than he could have imagined, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. But at least, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something right. The team moved into position as the operation began. The warehouse, located on the outskirts of the city, was quiet at first. The officers waited in the shadows, watching the building for any sign of movement. They were about to make their move. Their target was inside, and they were ready to close in. With the signal given, the officers moved in. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and the team flooded in, surrounding the criminals. There was no time for hesitation. The officers acted quickly, using their training to disarm the suspects and seize control of the situation. The criminals, caught off guard, attempted to fight back, but they were no match for the well-coordinated efforts of the officers. In the chaos, the mastermind behind the operation was revealed. It was someone they hadn't expected, an influential figure within the airline industry who had used his position of power to orchestrate the entire network. He was arrested on the spot, and the officers quickly moved to secure the rest of the building. As the dust settled, the team realized the magnitude of their success. They had brought down a criminal syndicate that had been operating in the shadows for years, but the victory was bittersweet. Stephen Reynolds had been a part of the operation, but he had helped bring it to an end. His cooperation had been crucial, and now it seemed that he might have a chance at redemption. For the officers, it was a job well done, but they knew the fight against crime was far from over. The mastermind had been arrested, and the syndicate was no more. But the team knew that there would always be more to uncover, more battles to fight. For now, though, they had won a significant victory. The operation to bring down the criminal syndicate had been successful, but it wasn't over yet. The officers had arrested several key players in the operation, including the mastermind who had been hiding in plain sight. However, as the days passed, it became clear that there were still loose ends to tie up. The syndicate had been running for years, and the depth of its reach was still unfolding. While the team had made significant strides, the impact of what they had uncovered would take time to fully comprehend. Stephen Reynolds, once a trusted airline pilot, was now facing a future that was uncertain, yet filled with a sense of relief. His cooperation had helped dismantle the operation, and he had given the officers the information they needed to bring down the criminals. But he wasn't walking away scot-free. The authorities had made it clear that he would face legal consequences for his role in the operation, but they had also promised him that his cooperation would be taken into account during his trial. It was a small comfort, but it was something. In the days following the raid, the authorities worked tirelessly to process the evidence and interview the suspects. The mastermind behind the operation, a high-ranking official in the airline industry, was at the center of the investigation. His arrest had shocked many, especially those who had trusted him for years. The team learned that he had been using his position to orchestrate the smuggling network, making it easier for drugs and other illegal goods to pass through airport security undetected. He had been using his access to flights, cargo shipments, and even flight attendants to ensure that the operation ran smoothly. For years, he had managed to stay one step ahead of the authorities. But now, with the network exposed, the officers knew they had to take swift action to ensure that the entire operation was shut down for good. They worked around the clock to gather information, interview witnesses, and follow every lead that came their way. Each piece of the puzzle brought them closer to understanding the full extent of the syndicate's reach. For Stephen, the days following his involvement in the investigation were filled with a mix of emotions. He had never imagined that his decision to make some extra money would lead to such chaos. His once straightforward life as an airline pilot had become a thing of the past. He was now caught in a legal battle that threatened to ruin everything he had worked for. Despite this, he knew he had made the right choice in helping the authorities bring down the syndicate. The guilt he had carried for months had started to ease, replaced by a sense of responsibility for what had been done. Stephen's cooperation had been invaluable in the investigation. He had provided crucial information that allowed the officers to track down members of the syndicate and connect the dots between the various players involved. However, as the trial approached, he realized that his involvement in the operation could not be overlooked. The charges against him were serious, and he had to face the consequences of his actions. Still, he hoped that the fact he had helped the authorities would weigh in his favor. The officers, too, had mixed feelings. On one hand, they had successfully taken down an international criminal syndicate, and their efforts were being recognized. Their hard work had paid off, and they had prevented countless illegal shipments from reaching their destinations. On the other hand, they knew that the fight against crime was ongoing. For every criminal they caught, there were more waiting to take their place. The work wasn't over, and they would have to remain vigilant to ensure that this syndicate, along with others, was wiped out for good. Officer Daniels, who had been at the center of the investigation, couldn't help but reflect on how the operation had unfolded. When the first alarm had been raised about Stephen Reynolds, he had never imagined the scale of the operation they would uncover. The discovery of the hidden compartment in the suitcase had been just the beginning. The network had been vast, with connections in airports around the world. It had been a shocking realization that the very system that was meant to keep people safe was being exploited for illegal gain. But with every arrest, with every piece of information they uncovered, the officers had chipped away at the operation. But even as the investigation wound down, Officer Daniels knew that there were always more criminals out there, hiding in plain sight. The justice system was designed to punish those who broke the law, but it didn't always offer a way to prevent future crimes. He hoped that the success of this operation would serve as a warning to those who thought they could operate in the shadows. But he also knew that the work of law enforcement was never truly done. There would always be someone willing to take risks, to break the rules, and to try to outsmart the system. For Stephen, the future was uncertain. The trial would determine his fate, and while he hoped for leniency given his cooperation, he knew that there were no guarantees. He had learned the hard way that every choice had consequences, and now he had to face the music. Yet, as the trial drew near, Stephen found some comfort in knowing that he had helped put an end to a dangerous operation. He had done the right thing, and no matter the outcome, he could walk away knowing that he had made a difference. In the end, the team's efforts paid off. The mastermind behind the operation was convicted, and several other members of the syndicate were also arrested and sentenced. The officers had successfully dismantled one of the largest smuggling networks in the world, and the sense of accomplishment was palpable. But they also knew that their work was just one piece of the puzzle. The fight against crime was an ongoing battle, and there would always be more work to do. As for Stephen, his journey was far from over. He would face the consequences of his actions, but he had also proven that even in the darkest of situations, redemption was possible. He had helped the authorities take down a dangerous network, and in doing so, he had started the process of rebuilding his life. Whether or not he would be able to fully recover from the fallout was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, he felt a sense of hope that things might eventually get better. The officers, satisfied with their success, went their separate ways. They knew the battle was far from over, but they had won a significant victory. As they looked toward the future, they understood that the fight against crime would continue, but for now, they could take pride in what they had accomplished. They had worked together, uncovered the truth, and brought justice to those who had been wronged.